On New Year's Eve in the year 2000, a young woman wrapped up her waitressing shift at 10 p.m. and began the mile-long trek back to her home through a small Texas town. Her parents, waiting back at the house with party hats and sparkling cider, had planned to welcome the new year together at midnight. But she never made it through the front door. By the time the clock struck 12, ushering in 2001, Lauren Hayes had seemingly vanished from the streets she had navigated her entire life. 15 years would slip by before anyone would uncover the truth about what transpired during that walk home. This narrative explores a disappearance that fractured a family and a search that refused to cease. Sometimes, the answers we seek arrive far too late. And sometimes, locating someone doesn't equate to bringing them back into your life. Bridgewater, Texas, nestled in the hill country west of Austin, was home to roughly 6,800 people. It was the type of community where the high school football stadium could hold more spectators than the number of residents living within the official town limits. Main Street consisted of the essentials: a hardware store, a diner, a drugstore, and little else. It was a place where everyone was familiar with everyone else's affairs, and an unfamiliar face would certainly draw attention. A town where young people typically departed for college and never returned, and the ones who remained did so because of deep family ties, the manageable cost of living, or because relocating to a bigger city like Austin or San Antonio seemed too overwhelming. At 23, Lauren Hayes was trying to figure out which group she truly belonged to. She had graduated from Texas State University the previous May with a degree in elementary education. The summer had been spent sending out applications, attending interviews, and holding out hope for a teaching position in a district where the salary could actually support her. She landed a job at Bridgewater Elementary in August. A second-grade teacher, she now had her own classroom, her own set of students, and her own bulletin boards to decorate. It was the career she had dedicated 4 years of her life to achieving. The sole drawback was the pay. A salary of $28,000 in 2000 didn't stretch quite as far as she had envisioned. After taxes, student loan payments, car insurance, and gas were deducted, there wasn't much disposable income left. Certainly not enough to rent her own place in town. Consequently, Lauren continued to reside with her parents, sleeping in her childhood bedroom with the same high school posters still adorning the walls. She felt as though she was caught in a holding pattern, educating second graders during the day and serving coffee to lifelong acquaintances at night. To supplement her teaching income, she had taken on a second job. She worked as a waitress at the roadside diner on Main Street, putting in most evenings after school and picking up extra shifts on weekends. The tips helped stretch her earnings enough to manage student loans and save a modest amount toward eventually moving out. Her parents were Margaret and Tom Hayes. Margaret, 48, served as a secretary at the middle school. With curly brown hair beginning to gray at the temples and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, she possessed a patient smile honed from years of managing teenagers and paperwork. Tom, 51, had retired from the Bridgewater Police Department 3 years earlier after a 25-year career. He now worked part-time in security at the high school, a job that mostly involved breaking up hallway arguments and ensuring doors were locked. He understood how to maintain composure during crises, knew the inner workings of investigations, and was acutely aware that most cases are solved within the first 48 hours, or not at all. They had raised Lauren in the small brick house on Cedar Lane, just 2 blocks from the elementary school. They had watched her transform from a talkative little girl with endless questions into a young woman determined to change the world, one second grader at a time. They didn't mind that she was still living at home. The house felt more complete with her there. They cherished having dinner together most nights, took comfort in knowing she was safe, and weren't quite ready for an empty nest. Lauren had mentioned possibly getting her own place in the spring, estimating she'd have enough saved for first and last month's rent by then. Secretly, Margaret hoped she'd wait a little longer. The Hayes family had established routines that held them together: Sunday dinners after church, Friday movie nights when Lauren wasn't working, and Saturday morning crossword puzzles at the kitchen table. The rhythm of life in small Texas towns is understood by our community, the delicate balance between seeking independence and needing family, the reality that young teachers often can't afford to live alone, and how second jobs become a necessity when pursuing your dreams doesn't quite cover the bills. December 31st, 2000, began like any other Sunday. Lauren slept in, attended church with her parents, and came home for lunch. She had the evening shift at the diner, scheduled from 4 to 10, covering for a coworker who wanted New Year's Eve off. Margaret had organized a small celebration at home, nothing extravagant, just the three of them watching the ball drop on TV, toasting with sparkling cider, and perhaps playing cards until they grew tired. Lauren promised she'd be home by 10:15 at the latest. The diner was bustling that evening. People stopped in for coffee before heading to parties. Families grabbed dinner before the countdown began, and regulars with nowhere else to be on New Year's Eve came in. Lauren worked steadily, refilling coffee, taking orders, and maintaining her smile even as her feet ached from a long week. Around 8 o'clock, a man entered and sat at the counter. Lauren had seen him before, maybe twice in the past month. He always chose the counter, always ordered coffee and pie, and always left the exact change. She didn't know his name. He never made conversation beyond placing his order. Yet, something about him made her uneasy in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The way he watched people, how his eyes tracked her movements around the diner. She had mentioned it to Rita, the other waitress on duty that night. Rita, 55, had worked at the diner for 20 years and had seen every type of customer imaginable. She shrugged it off, suggesting the guy was probably harmless, probably just lonely, and that half the regulars were a little odd. But when Lauren brought the man his coffee and pie that evening, his hand deliberately brushed hers as she set down the plate. His eyes met hers and held the gaze for a moment too long. Lauren pulled her hand back and walked away, her skin crawling. She told Rita she was taking her break, went to the back room, and tried to shake off the feeling, convincing herself she was overreacting, that a brief touch meant nothing, that she was simply tired and wanted to finish the shift and go home. When she returned, the man was gone. He had left his exact change on the counter as usual. The remainder of the shift passed quickly. By 9:50, the diner was nearly deserted. Everyone had left to make it to their parties before midnight. Rita told Lauren to go ahead and leave, that she would close up on her own. Lauren didn't argue. She was eager to get home, to be with her parents when the clock struck midnight. She changed out of her uniform, grabbed her purse, said goodbye to Rita, and pushed through the front door into the cold December night. Main Street was lively. Cars drove past, people walked between houses, and music drifted from an open window somewhere. The air felt charged with anticipation. Lauren started walking home. It was a mile from the diner to Cedar Lane, a route she had walked hundreds of times, knowing every crack in the sidewalk and every dog that barked as she passed. The first few blocks were well-lit and busy. Lauren passed familiar faces, waving and calling out, "Happy New Year." Everything felt normal, safe, and familiar. Then she turned onto Oak Street, a quieter residential area with fewer streetlights and houses set further back from the road. Still safe, still her town, just darker and quieter. Halfway down Oak Street, Lauren heard footsteps behind her. It wasn't unusual for others to be walking at night, but something prompted her to glance back. A figure was walking about 20 feet behind her, wearing a dark jacket with hands in pockets. She couldn't make out the face clearly in the dim light between street lamps. Lauren walked faster. The footsteps behind her matched her pace. Her heart began to pound harder. She told herself she was being paranoid. This was Bridgewater. People walked at night. It didn't have to mean anything. But the footsteps remained exactly 20 feet behind her, never closer, never farther. Lauren turned onto Elm Street, taking a slightly longer route home, but one that stayed on more populated roads. The footsteps turned, following her. She was 4 blocks from home. Her hand gripped her purse tighter. She thought about the small canister of pepper spray her father had given her when she started working night shifts. If you've ever walked alone at night and felt the weight of footsteps behind you, felt your throat tighten and your breathing become shallow, you understand the specific fear Lauren Hayes experienced during those final blocks. She turned onto Maple Street, 3 blocks from home. The footsteps persisted. She considered running, screaming, or knocking on a random door. But what would she say? That someone was walking behind her. That wasn't proof of danger, just paranoia. She turned onto Cedar Lane, 2 blocks from home. She could see houses, recognize porch lights glowing. The footsteps were still there. Lauren walked faster, nearly running now, her breath coming quickly in the cold air. 1 more block. She could see her house, the porch light her mother always left on. She walked as fast as she could without actually running. Her keys were already in her hand. Half a block from home, almost safe. The footsteps behind her suddenly accelerated. Lauren broke into a run. She made it 10 feet before a hand grabbed her arm. She tried to scream, but another hand covered her mouth. She was pulled backward off the sidewalk into the dark space between two houses. She fought, kicked, and tried to bite the hand over her mouth. Her purse fell, its contents scattering across the pavement. But whoever had her was stronger, much stronger. The last thing Lauren Hayes saw before everything went dark was the glow of her own porch light. So close she could have reached it in 30 more seconds. At 11:55 p.m., Margaret Hayes looked at the clock and wondered where Lauren was. She should have been home by now. At 11:57, Tom suggested she might have stopped to talk to someone. You know how Lauren was always chatting. At 11:58, Margaret went to the window and looked out. No sign of Lauren on the street. At midnight, as fireworks erupted across Bridgewater and people cheered and embraced, Margaret felt the first real stab of worry. By 12:15 a.m., after Tom had walked around the block calling Lauren's name and found nothing, Margaret's hands were shaking as she dialed 911. Tom's police training kicked in immediately. He knew what to look for, knew how to preserve a scene. When he found Lauren's purse on the sidewalk between two houses 3 doors down, he didn't touch it. He just stood there, looking at the scattered contents, feeling his heart break. By 12:30 a.m., his former colleagues were searching Cedar Lane with flashlights. Tom stood on the porch with Margaret, one arm around her shoulders, watching the search unfold. He knew what they were thinking. He had worked enough missing person cases to know the statistics. He just never imagined he'd be living one. By 1 a.m., they had photographed the scene. Wallet still there with money and ID. Keys on the ground. Cell phone smashed, screen cracked. By 2 a.m., Chief Daniel Morrison was standing in the Hayes living room. He had been Tom's partner for 10 years before Tom retired. Now, he had to tell his friend that this was being treated as an abduction. Tom already knew. He had known the moment he saw that purse on the ground. By dawn, the FBI had been called. Special Agent Catherine Ross arrived from the Austin field office and set up a command center at the police station. By morning, Lauren Hayes' face was on every TV screen in Texas. 23 years old, brown hair, hazel eyes, 5 feet 6 inches, 125 pounds. Last seen wearing jeans, a green sweater, and a black winter coat. Last seen leaving the roadside diner at approximately 9:50 p.m. Rita from the diner told police about the man who had come in that evening. The regular customer who always sat at the counter. She didn't know his name, had never really paid him much attention, just another face. But she remembered Lauren mentioning he made her uncomfortable. Remembered him leaving right before Lauren's shift ended. Police pulled the diner's security footage, grainy, black and white, but clear enough. The man at the counter, medium build, dark hair, maybe in his 30s or 40s, wearing a jacket and baseball cap that hid most of his face. They showed the footage on the news, asking anyone who recognized the man to call the tip line. Tips came in. People thought they'd seen him, thought they knew who he was. Every lead was checked. None led anywhere concrete. Margaret and Tom Hayes spent New Year's Day 2001 in a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Police in their house asking questions, reporters on their lawn, neighbors bringing food nobody could eat. Margaret kept saying Lauren had been so close to home. So close. If she had walked faster, if she had left work 5 minutes earlier, if Margaret had gone out to meet her. Tom stayed quiet. He knew from experience that what-ifs didn't help. But late at night, when Margaret finally cried herself to sleep, he would stand at Lauren's bedroom door and feel the weight of every case he'd ever worked, every family he'd ever had to tell there were no leads, no answers, no hope. This time, he was that family, and he knew exactly how bad the odds were. The first 48 hours after Lauren Hayes disappeared felt like 48 years to Margaret and Tom. They didn't sleep, didn't eat, just sat in their living room watching police come and go with information that led nowhere. Tom knew the statistics. He had worked missing person cases for 25 years. Knew that if someone wasn't found in the first 2 days, the chances dropped dramatically. Knew that abducted adults rarely came home alive. He didn't tell Margaret any of this. He just held her hand and told her they'd find Lauren, that the FBI was good at this, that there were leads being followed. But by the 3rd day, when the FBI still hadn't identified the man from the diner footage, when every tip had been checked and dismissed, Tom felt the hope starting to drain away. By the end of the first week, the media attention had shifted to other stories. By the end of the first month, the daily updates from Chief Morrison had become weekly calls that said the same thing. No new leads, still investigating, we haven't given up. But Tom knew what that meant. The case was going cold. Margaret refused to accept it. She printed flyers with Lauren's photo and drove to every town within 100 miles, taping them to gas station bulletin boards, handing them to strangers, asking if anyone had seen her daughter. Most people took the flyers politely and threw them away later. Some promised to keep an eye out. Nobody ever called with real information. Our community of families dealing with missing loved ones understands this particular torture. The way hope becomes something you have to fight for every single day. The way people stop asking about your missing daughter because they don't know what to say anymore. Margaret started a support group for families of missing persons in the spring of 2001. They met in the church basement once a month. Sometimes 15 people showed up, sometimes 3. They shared stories, shared frustration, shared the specific pain of not knowing. Tom went to the first meeting and never returned. Said it was too hard listening to other people's tragedies when he was drowning in his own. Margaret understood. Grief looked different for everyone. The FBI kept the case open, but the investigation slowed to almost nothing by summer. Agent Ross called every few months with updates that weren't really updates. They were still looking, still had Lauren's file active, but no new evidence had emerged. The man from the diner had never been identified. The security footage was too grainy, the description too generic. Dark hair, medium build, 30s or 40s. That could describe half the men in Texas. Police had interviewed everyone who'd been on those streets that night. Knocked on every door on Oak, Elm, Maple, and Cedar. Asked if anyone had seen anything, heard anything, noticed anyone suspicious. A few people remembered seeing Lauren walking. Nobody remembered seeing anyone following her. Nobody heard screams or sounds of a struggle. The houses near where her purse was found had elderly residents who were already asleep by 11 p.m. Whoever took Lauren had done it quietly, quickly, efficiently. Had planned it well enough that there were no witnesses, no evidence beyond a scattered purse and a smashed phone. Tom spent hours going over the case file. His former colleagues let him look at everything. Knew he needed to feel like he was doing something. He studied the security footage until he had memorized every frame. Drove the route from the diner to their house dozens of times, trying to figure out where someone could have grabbed her without being seen. The gap between the 2 houses where her purse was found. That's where it happened. A blind spot between streetlights, houses set back from the road, no direct sight lines from neighboring windows. Whoever took her had known the area, had chosen that spot specifically, had probably watched Lauren walk home before, had learned her routine. The thought made Tom sick, that someone had been stalking his daughter and none of them had noticed. By the first anniversary of Lauren's disappearance, the case was officially cold. Agent Ross called to tell them the FBI was moving Lauren's file to inactive status. Said it didn't mean they'd given up, just that active resources needed to go to cases with leads. Margaret cried for 3 days straight. Tom didn't cry at all, just got quieter, more withdrawn, spent more hours at work because home felt like a tomb. They kept Lauren's room exactly as she'd left it. Her teaching materials from that first semester scattered on her desk, the outfit she'd worn to church that Sunday hanging on her closet door. Her bed still unmade from that morning. Margaret changed the sheets once a month, even though nobody slept there. Dusted the furniture. Kept everything ready for when Lauren came home. If you've ever lived in a house haunted by absence, you know how every room becomes a reminder of who's missing. How you avoid certain spaces because the memories hurt too much to touch. The years crawled forward. Margaret kept working at the middle school. Tom kept working security at the high school. They went through the motions of living without really being alive. They stopped celebrating holidays. Couldn't bear New Year's Eve especially. Margaret would go to bed early every December 31st, take sleeping pills so she wouldn't be awake at midnight remembering. Lauren's birthday in June was almost as bad. Margaret would bake a cake, put it on the kitchen table, light candles, sing happy birthday to an empty room. 24th birthday, 25th, 26th. Tom started drinking more than he should. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to numb the edges of grief that never seemed to dull on their own. Margaret pretended not to notice the bottles in the recycling bin. Their marriage strained under the weight of loss. They loved each other, but love wasn't enough to fill the space Lauren had left. They existed together rather than lived together. Two people drowning separately in the same house. By 2005, most people in Bridgewater had stopped mentioning Lauren. The case had become local legend. The teacher who vanished on New Year's Eve. The mystery that was never solved. A cautionary tale about walking alone at night. But Margaret never stopped. She kept printing flyers with age-progressed photos. Lauren at 25, Lauren at 28, Lauren at 30. Each version showed a stranger Margaret had never met. She drove to neighboring towns every few months, put up new flyers, asked the same questions. Most people didn't remember the old flyers, didn't recognize the face, couldn't help. Margaret had a routine. Every Sunday after church, she'd drive to a different town, spend the afternoon putting up flyers, come home exhausted and empty-handed. Tom stopped going with her after the first year. Said it was too hard. Margaret went alone. By 2010, a decade had passed. Lauren would be 33 now. Probably wouldn't look much like the age-progressed photos anymore. Those were guesses based on genetics and statistics, not real life. Margaret was 58, her hair completely gray now. Tom was 61, had retired from the high school security job, spent most days watching TV and avoiding conversations about the daughter they'd lost. They'd stopped talking about Lauren at home. Too painful. They'd said everything there was to say 1,000 times over. Now they just lived in the silence of shared grief that had no words left. And 300 miles away, in a small apartment in Dallas, a woman who called herself Rachel Morrison was struggling to remember anything before 2008. She was in her early 30s, worked as a bookkeeper for a mid-sized accounting firm, lived a quiet life that felt safe but empty in ways she couldn't explain. She'd been in therapy for 7 years, trying to piece together the missing parts of her memory, trying to understand why she couldn't remember her childhood, her family, anything before waking up in a hospital in 2001 with a head injury that had erased most of her past. The doctor said it was retrograde amnesia caused by severe head trauma. Said sometimes memories came back, sometimes they didn't. That she should focus on building new memories rather than chasing old ones. But Rachel couldn't let it go. She felt like she was living someone else's life. Like the person she'd been before the accident was still buried somewhere deep, trying to surface. Her therapist, Dr. Patricia Chun, had suggested she start recording her thoughts. Said sometimes speaking out loud helped access memories that written words couldn't reach. So Rachel had started making recordings, audio journals of her thoughts, her dreams, the fragments of memory that felt like they might be real or might be her brain trying to fill in gaps with fiction. In 2014, Dr. Chin suggested she put the recordings online, said connecting with others who'd experienced memory loss might help. That community could be healing. Rachel had hesitated. Putting her voice out there felt vulnerable, exposed. But she was desperate. Desperate to remember, desperate to feel whole. So in January 2015, she'd created a YouTube channel, called it Fragments, posted audio recordings with simple visual backgrounds, nature scenes, abstract art, anything that wouldn't distract from her voice. She talked about what it felt like to wake up one day and not know who you were. About the terror of looking in mirrors and seeing a stranger. About building an identity from nothing when you had no foundation to build on. She talked about the dreams that felt like memories, a yellow house, the smell of coffee, a woman's laugh that made her feel safe. Were they real or just her brain making up stories to fill the void? She talked about the therapy sessions, the dead ends, the frustration of feeling like she'd lost herself and would never find the way back. The channel didn't have many subscribers, maybe 300 people. But the ones who listened left comments saying they understood, that they'd been through similar things, that her voice helped them feel less alone. Rachel kept posting every week, a new recording. Sometimes about the hard days when memory loss felt like drowning. Sometimes about the small victories when she remembered how to do something her hands knew even if her mind didn't. And 300 miles away in Bridgewater, Margaret Hayes was about to stumble onto a voice that would change everything. It was October 2015. Margaret was cleaning out the spare bedroom, going through boxes of old photos, when she needed a break from the memories that hurt to touch. She sat down at the computer, opened YouTube, looking for something mindless to distract herself. Cooking videos, maybe garden tours, anything that wasn't grief. The algorithm suggested a channel based on her search history. Fragments. A woman talking about memory loss. Margaret almost scrolled past, but something made her click. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the universe putting her in the right place at the right time. The video started. No face on screen, just audio over a background of moving clouds. A woman's voice, calm and thoughtful, talking about what it felt like to live without a past. Margaret listened while folding laundry. The woman was talking about dreams that might be memories, about teaching, about feeling like she'd been a teacher once, but not knowing if that was real. Margaret's hands stilled on a towel. The voice, the way she spoke, the slight Texas drawl that softened certain words. Margaret's heart started beating faster. She rewound the video, listened again, focused on the voice this time, the breathing patterns, the way the woman paused between thoughts. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Voices were common. Thousands of women in Texas spoke like this. But Margaret couldn't shake it. Something about the voice felt familiar in a way that went beyond reason. She clicked through to other videos on the channel, listened to 3, 4, 5 in a row. The woman talked about amnesia, about a car accident in 2000 that had stolen her memory, about waking up in a hospital with no ID and no past. Margaret's hands were shaking now. She listened to the woman describe fragments of memory. Teaching children, second graders, reading stories out loud, the feeling of chalk dust on her fingers. Lauren had taught second grade for one semester before she disappeared. Margaret told herself she was reaching. That grief made you see connections that weren't there. That she'd spent 15 years looking for Lauren in every brown-haired woman she saw. But this voice. Margaret downloaded the videos, played them over and over, closed her eyes, and tried to strip away 15 years. Tried to hear her daughter in this stranger's voice. By the time Tom came home from his afternoon walk, Margaret was crying at the computer. "I found her," she whispered. "Tom, I think I found our daughter." Tom Hayes stood in the doorway of the spare bedroom, staring at his wife hunched over the computer, tears streaming down her face, and felt his stomach drop. In 15 years of grief, he'd watched Margaret chase hundreds of leads that went nowhere. Heard her say she'd found Lauren a dozen times based on a glimpse of brown hair in a crowd, a woman's laugh in a grocery store, a face that looked similar in a stranger's Facebook photo. Every single time, it had been nothing. Every single time, he'd watched hope shatter her all over again. He wanted to tell her to stop, to protect herself, to accept that Lauren was gone. But he couldn't, because somewhere deep down, he'd never accepted it either. "What did you find?" His voice was careful, neutral, trying not to add weight to whatever she was about to say. Margaret turned the computer screen toward him. "Listen." She played a video. A woman's voice, no face, just audio over a moving background talking about memory loss, about amnesia, about teaching. Tom listened for 30 seconds. Margaret, no. Listen to the voice. 5 days later, Reeves called with information. The YouTube channel belonged to Rachel Morrison, 35 years old, lived in Dallas, worked as a bookkeeper at Henderson & Associates. No social media presence beyond YouTube, no photos online, very private. According to public records, Rachel Morrison had appeared in the system in 2001. No records before that. No birth certificate, no school transcripts, no employment history. Just suddenly existed starting in 2001, which meant Rachel Morrison wasn't her real name. It was an identity created after the fact. Reeves had more. Rachel Morrison had been admitted to Parkland Hospital in Dallas on January 3, 2001, with severe head trauma. Found near the hospital entrance, unconscious, no ID, no purse, no phone. Someone had left her there and disappeared. She'd been in a coma for 3 days. When she woke up, she couldn't remember anything. Police had run her fingerprints, dental records, everything. No matches. She'd been listed as a Jane Doe for 6 months while they tried to identify her. Eventually, social services had helped her build a new identity, given her the name Rachel Morrison, helped her get documents, connected her with resources for memory loss patients. She'd spent the past 14 years living as Rachel Morrison because nobody had ever figured out who she really was. Tom's hands shook when he hung up the phone. She was found 3 days after Lauren disappeared. In Dallas. That's 300 miles from here. Margaret was already reaching for her coat. "We need to go there. We need to see her. We can't just show up. We need to be careful. If this is Lauren, if she really doesn't remember us, we could traumatize her. Then what do we do?" Tom called Reeves back, asked him to make contact, to approach Rachel Morrison carefully, explain the situation, see if she'd be willing to meet with them. Reeves said he'd handle it. Give him a few days. Those few days felt like years. Reeves finally called on a Thursday afternoon. Said he'd approached Rachel Morrison, told her there was a family in Bridgewater who believed she might be their missing daughter. Showed her photos of Lauren from 2000. Rachel had stared at the photos for a long time. Said the face looked familiar, but she couldn't say if it was her or if it was just her brain trying to make connections that weren't there. She'd agreed to meet with Margaret and Tom. Said she'd been searching for her identity for 14 years. If there was even a chance they had answers, she wanted to hear them. The meeting was set for Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop in Dallas. Neutral ground, public space. Rachel wanted to feel safe. Margaret and Tom drove to Dallas that Saturday morning. The 2-hour drive felt endless. Neither of them spoke much. Both too nervous, too hopeful, too terrified of being wrong. They arrived at the coffee shop 30 minutes early. Sat in a corner booth with untouched cups of coffee going cold, watching the door, waiting. At exactly 2 p.m., a woman walked in. Brown hair, medium height, wearing jeans and a sweater. She looked around uncertainly, spotted Reeves, who'd come to make introductions, and walked over. Margaret's breath caught. The woman's face was older, different, marked by 15 years of life. But the eyes, the way she moved, the expression when she was uncertain about something. It was Lauren. Margaret knew it in her bones. The woman sat down across from them. Looked at Margaret, then Tom, her expression cautious. I'm Rachel Morrison. Or at least that's who I've been for the past 14 years. Margaret's hands were shaking so badly, she had to clasp them together. I'm Margaret Hayes. This is my husband, Tom. Our daughter, Lauren, disappeared on New Year's Eve in 2000. She was 23 years old. We've been looking for her ever since. Rachel's eyes were wary. Mr. Reeves showed me photos. I don't remember being that person. I don't remember you. We know, Tom said gently. We know you have amnesia. We're not here to force anything. We just want to understand what happened. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she started talking about waking up in the hospital with no memory. About the car accident the police said she'd been in, though no accident had ever been reported. About building a life from nothing because nobody could tell her who she was. She talked about the dreams that felt like memories. Teaching, children, a yellow house. But she'd never known if they were real or just her brain filling in gaps. Margaret listened with tears streaming down her face. You were a teacher. 2nd grade. At Bridgewater Elementary. You lived with us in a yellow house on Cedar Lane. Rachel's breath hitched. I dreamed about that house. I thought I made it up. Tom pulled out more photos. Lauren as a baby, a child, a teenager. Lauren graduating college. Lauren on her first day of teaching. Rachel stared at them, her hands trembling. I don't remember. But looking at these feels like I should. Like there's something there I can't quite reach. Can we do a DNA test? Margaret asked. To know for sure. Rachel nodded. I want to know. I've wanted to know who I am my entire adult life. The DNA test was done at a lab in Dallas. Results took 3 days. Those 3 days were agony. Margaret and Tom stayed in a hotel. Couldn't bear to drive home without knowing. When the call came, Tom answered, listened, hung up, looked at Margaret with tears in his eyes. It's her. 99.9% match. Rachel Morrison is Lauren Hayes. Margaret collapsed. 15 years of searching, 15 years of grief, and their daughter had been alive the entire time, living 300 miles away, not knowing who she was. They met with Lauren again the next day, told her the results. Lauren cried, not from joy exactly, from confusion, from grief for the life she'd lost, from overwhelming emotion she couldn't name. What happened to me? She asked. How did I end up in Dallas with no memory? That's when the FBI got involved. Agent Catherine Ross, the same agent who'd worked Lauren's case in 2001, came out of retirement to help investigate. Hospital records from 2001 were pulled. Lauren had been admitted with severe head trauma, fractured skull, brain swelling, injuries consistent with a car accident at high speed. But no accident had been reported. No car found. No other victims. Someone had hurt Lauren badly enough to cause permanent brain damage, then had left her at the hospital entrance and disappeared. Police theorized it had been her abductor, that whoever took her on New Year's Eve had driven her to Dallas, had gotten into an accident, had panicked, and left her at the hospital rather than risk being caught. Security footage from the hospital was long gone. Records from 2001 didn't show who'd brought her in. The trail was ice cold. Lauren's medical records showed something else. The head trauma had caused severe retrograde amnesia. Her brain had been damaged in the areas that stored long-term memory. The doctors in 2001 had said she might never remember her past. They'd been right. Lauren underwent more testing. Brain scans showed permanent damage. The neurologist said her memories from before 2001 were likely gone forever. The neural pathways that held those memories had been destroyed by the injury. She might get flashes, fragments, feelings, but she would probably never remember being Lauren Hayes. Never remember her parents, her childhood, teaching second grade, walking home on New Year's Eve. Margaret asked if she could tell Lauren about her life, share stories, show photos, help her understand who she'd been. The therapist said yes, but cautioned that it wouldn't bring the memories back. Lauren would know the facts of her past, but wouldn't feel the emotions attached to them. It would be like learning about a stranger's life. Over the next months, Margaret did exactly that. Sat with Lauren for hours, showed her photo albums, told her stories about the little girl who asked endless questions and the young woman who wanted to teach. Lauren listened, asked questions, tried to make the stories feel real, but they didn't. They were just facts, just information about someone she used to be but couldn't remember being. Tom struggled with it more than Margaret did. He'd gotten his daughter back, but not really. The person sitting across from him looked like Lauren, but wasn't her. Not the Lauren he remembered. Our community knows that sometimes finding someone doesn't mean bringing them home. That missing pieces don't always fit back together the way they used to. Lauren kept living in Dallas, kept working as a bookkeeper, kept her life as Rachel Morrison because that was the only life she remembered having. But she visited Bridgewater once a month, had dinners with Margaret and Tom, let them tell her about the person she used to be, built a relationship with parents who were strangers but who'd never stopped loving her. Margaret asked about the YouTube channel. Lauren said Dr. Chun had suggested it as therapy, that speaking into the void had helped her process the loss of identity. Margaret said she was glad Lauren had done it, because without those videos, they never would have found her. The FBI investigation into who took Lauren went nowhere. The man from the diner was never identified. No evidence ever emerged about what happened in those 3 days between when Lauren was taken and when she was left at the hospital. The prevailing theory was that her abductor had gotten into a car accident while fleeing with her, had panicked when he saw how badly she was hurt, had left her at the hospital to save her life while saving his own freedom. But there was no proof, no witnesses, no forensics after 15 years. The person who took Lauren Hayes was never found, was still out there somewhere, would never face justice for what he'd done. Margaret struggled with that. Wanted closure, wanted someone to blame, wanted punishment for the person who'd stolen 15 years of her daughter's life. But Tom, who'd spent 25 years in law enforcement, knew that sometimes cases didn't get solved. Sometimes the bad guys got away. Sometimes you had to find peace without justice. On New Year's Eve 2016, the Hayes family gathered in the Yellow House on Cedar Lane. Margaret, Tom, and Lauren watched the ball drop on TV, toasting with sparkling cider. Lauren didn't remember the last time they'd done this. Didn't remember waiting for her daughter to come home on New Year's Eve 2000. Didn't remember being that daughter. But she was here now, and that had to be enough. Margaret looked at her daughter and felt the complicated mix of joy and grief that came from finding someone who'd been lost but couldn't really come home. "I'm glad you found me," Lauren said quietly. "Even if I can't remember, I'm glad I know where I came from." Margaret squeezed her hand. "We never stopped looking. Not for one single day." If this story reminded you that the truth doesn't always bring closure, that some mysteries stay mysteries forever, remember this. Somewhere out there, another person is still missing. Another family is still searching. Another voice is still waiting to be heard. Pay attention when something feels wrong. Trust your instincts. Believe in the possibility that answers might come from unexpected places. Because Lauren Hayes was found because her mother listened to a voice on YouTube and refused to dismiss what her heart knew was true. Because a private investigator followed the threads that connected nothing to something. Because parents never stopped believing their daughter was out there somewhere. The person who took her was never caught. Justice was never served. But Lauren was alive.